Hey, this is Josh Matthews Morgan with Learn Your Brain, and I am going to talk today about a very honest, vulnerable subject, and that is what we call our self-story. I'm going to be really, really real with you about some of the stuff some of the beliefs and the stories that I had about myself, even up until recently, that were kind of buried deep in my brain. And so in this video, let me just kind of tell you what we're going to cover. I'm going to talk about some of the negative, crippling beliefs that formed my self story and how they impacted my life. I will kind of explain what a self story is and show you a little simple image of the brain that will get you to kind of really see it. It's a nice visual. And then I'll give you a 60-second overview of how these self stories get created and how they impact you today, right? And then finally, I'll give you a quick tip on how we can change or update our self story to a more positive, compassionate version that is supports our success and supports the things that we want in our life. So without further ado, I'm going to share some beliefs that I've written down. This is really just a small sample of some of the stuff that I've discovered and I've cleared. And as you can see, I've got this handy notepad sheet, really high tech. And next to each of the beliefs, we part of the process of clearing these things is you always put a number to it from 1 to 10, so you can measure the strength of it and to make sure it's coming down using the erase and replace technique that we teach people. So these, as you can see, the ones I'm going to read are like 15. I wrote 15 because it was just so intense, the feeling, and 10 on some of these. So let me read a couple of them out. The truth about me is that I'm bad to the core, right? That was one of my beliefs. Nobody can truly love me. I only deserve rejection. Pretty strong. The sadness and pain. I feel this sadness and pain because I don't matter. Okay. These are, as you can see, these are really strong feelings. I'm just going to read a few more off. I hate myself for being a weak loser. I'm ashamed of who I am, and I'm ashamed of being so weak. I feel this overwhelming self-hatred for being weak and not tough enough. And I actually had, physical reactions when I like a feeling that I needed to throw up when I would identify these feelings and bring them up to the surface. So I'm not telling you this. I mean, I'm telling you this not to, just lay out all my dirty laundry on the table, but because we truly believe that the way to change these things is to shine a light on them, shine a light on your self story. This is something that was happening beneath the surface for me, all these feelings. And the way it came out for me the most was, it would affect my sleep. That was the biggest problem that I had. I've struggled with sleep problems because at night I would get hit with this anxiety whenever we're, making moves in our business or pushing things ahead. And that's how these unconscious messages would play in my brain and we're sort of trapped in my body, right? Because these stories don't just exist in a vacuum. The way we experience them is usually in our bodies, especially if it's a really negative story. So let's go to what is a self story, right? And I'm going to switch my screens here and show you what we call the stick person image. And this is just a really simple graphic that shows the two parts to your mind or your brain, whatever you want to call it. Now, this is an oversimplification, obviously, but this is what we explain to everyone in all of our training and all of our coaching, is that you really have two parts to your brain. We call it the rational part on the top and then the emotional or feeling part. These are distinct, different brain systems in the brain. And again, it's an oversimplification, but it really is true that these are separate systems. And so your self story are the deeper feelings, stories, and belief that you have about yourself. And it's stored down here in this bottom part in the emotional feeling brain. And oftentimes the challenge with them is that they're unconscious, right? We're not aware of the story. We know how it impacts us usually, maybe in the form of anxiety, or maybe it causes us to live small, or maybe, we don't believe in ourselves, and so we don't take big action. There's so many different ways that these negative self stories manifest themselves, but it's really because of a programmed lesson or a programmed belief in the emotional brain. So how you feel about yourself and your self story is not like cut and dried. You might have a positive self story in certain aspects or areas of your life, but then in others have a very negative, like mine, a very negative self story that's almost crippling. And it doesn't always come up in a sort of predictable pattern. It doesn't always cause problems in a particular pattern. But let me show you quickly how these self stories are created, right? And I'll explain the 20-second version of how mine was created. And so I'm going to switch back to this image here and go to the next screen. And this is kind of hang on, there we go. This is a simple depiction of self-story, right? It looks a little bit complicated, but it's really not. So it always starts with you experiencing something that is difficult, challenging, or negative in your life, right? Or at least that you interpret as that, right? So your emotional brain we have here in step 1, it sees a threat, right? It sees this really bad, negative, painful thing, and it reacts to it. Threat, bad, pain. And that's step 2, right? Your brain and your body react to protect you from that thing. It sounds alarm bells in your body, and in your emotional brain sort of hijacks your rational brain. So your rational brain really shuts down, and that explains why when you really were anxious, you have a hard time really thinking clearly and staying present and focused. It's because you're under this sort of the fire alarm effect of experiencing negative things, right? You might have tight shoulders, you might have a queasy stomach. Then let's say that the challenge, the difficulty passes, right? It's gone, it's no longer in the past, but the story gets stored in your emotional brain as a lesson, right? It's your emotional brain basically says, "Oh man, that was really that sucked. That was really bad. Let me store that and remember that for later," right? And so it creates a story, it creates a lesson about that negative experience that can be buried for a long time, can be below the surface for a long time, just waiting for the right circumstances to trigger it and to bring it up. So that's the really brief version of how these stories get created. All right, so let me talk for a second about like kind of how it could get triggered. So, or maybe it's actually better to give you more context. So mine, a lot of those negative feelings came from my high school experience when I was a wrestler in high school, and I put a lot of emphasis on being successful. It was like an obsession for me to become successful at wrestling. And the challenge that I had was that I kept getting hurt. I had surgery on my shoulder my sophomore year, which actually put me out my entire junior year. I was recovering from that surgery, and I dislocated my knee. First I dislocated that same shoulder right before, in the summer before my senior year, and then I dislocated my knee, which was a very traumatic experience for me. And it was literally the night before our first match, and that put me out for a couple months, at least 6 weeks. And it basically wrecked my senior year. So I had all these expectations for myself. I had to put all this importance on succeeding. And then when I couldn't, because my body was hurt, broken, these were not light injuries. The knee injury actually caused me to have PTSD, and that I didn't really discover until about 10 years after the incident, when I was having really horrible sleep problems. But that'll be a video for another day when I'm talking about my experiences about that. But, these were the lessons that I learned. And here's the key. I never sat down and said this really negative self-story about myself, right? I never consciously made a decision that I was going to feel that way, that this was the truth about me, right? It was something that happened at a deep level, at an unconscious level. This learning happens largely 90+% of it happens unconsciously. And so the problem is these stories get created and we're not aware when we create them, and we're usually not aware when they come up and cause us havoc in our life, right? But the single most important thing you can do in order to get freedom from it is to discover the story, right? Discover the meaning that was placed on those events. It's the absolute way to free yourself. And often when you do that, when you often discover the story, you weaken the story, or it can even disappear. So becoming self-aware, getting more in tune with your body and what your body is trying to tell you is one simple way to do it. And, asking your body when it is going into this freak out mode, when your negative self-story is created, is one way to do it. Just say, body, what are you trying to tell me? What is this experience about? What's the lesson that I learned from this? And we've really made it our mission to shine a light in our company on these lower parts of the brain. The if I can go back to the slide, the emotional part of the brain. And that's because that's the part that really determines your success. That's the part that stores your self-story. And, we always say you can never go beyond your level of belief in yourself. You can never succeed beyond your story. I didn't believe that I deserved to be successful for a long time, for years. And it was just this hidden landmine that kept tripping me up. And once I finally started peeling back the layers of this and used some of the brain, really the key was using some of the brain tools that we teach in our Tools for Transformation program. That is what allowed me to free myself, to update my story, to feel like I was deserving of love. I was good at my core, that none of that stuff that I believed was actually the truth about me. And none of that stuff, if you have some negative self-beliefs, are the truth about you. I want to just assure you of that. It might be how you feel, and it might feel like the truth, but it's not the truth. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with that quick message. And I encourage you to become more and more aware of your self-story, right? Is it a positive one? Does it have some room for improvement? Do you need to tweak it? Right? This is a really powerful concept to understand when it comes to being successful long-term. So I'm going to sign off for now. If you have any questions, feel free to leave your questions in below on the video. We're always happy to answer any questions you have. All right, I'll sign off now. Enjoyed this. Take care.